If you spent more than $50 on groceries this week, what I'm about to show you is going to make you furious. In 1935, an American mother could feed her entire family dinner every night for less than 15 cents a meal. Today, the exact same ingredients would cost you $12. And the recipes that made it possible have been buried for almost a century. Not because they stopped working, because the companies selling you $8 bread and $14 chicken hope you'd never find out they existed. Today I'm pulling 30 of those meals out of the vault. Recipes your great-grandmother made every single week. Recipes that fed families of 6, 7, 8 people on wages that wouldn't cover a cup of coffee in 2026. Stay until the end, because meal number 27 is the one the food industry spent 50 years trying to make you forget. It costs 11 cents to make. It feeds 8 people, and it tastes better than almost anything in your kitchen tonight. Before we start, you need to understand what food actually cost in 1933. A loaf of bread was 7 cents. A pound of ground beef was 11 cents. A dozen eggs was 29 cents. A pound of potatoes was 2 cents. A quart of milk was 10 cents. 5 pounds of flour cost 23 cents. A pound of dried beans cost 6 cents. A pound of lard cost 8 cents. A can of tomatoes was 9 cents. These are not adjusted for inflation. These are the actual prices families saw at the register. And every single recipe on this list was built around those numbers, because it had to be. When your husband earns $12 a week and you have 5 mouths to feed, you don't cook with inspiration, you cook with arithmetic. Let's start. Meal number 1. The poor man's meal. This is probably the most famous Depression-era dish ever recorded, thanks to a 91-year-old woman named Clara Canucciari, who filmed herself making it on YouTube in 2007. The recipe is dead simple. You peel and cube 4 potatoes. You fry them in a tablespoon of lard until they're golden. Then you dice 1 onion, toss it in, and crack 2 eggs over the top. You stir everything together until the eggs set. That's it. 4 ingredients. Total cost in 1934, about 4 cents. It fed a family of 4. Clara said her mother made it 3 times a week because the children never got tired of it. The potatoes gave them energy. The eggs gave them protein. The lard gave them fat they desperately needed. And the onion made the whole thing taste like somebody cared. Meal number 2. Depression stew, sometimes called Hoover stew, because families blamed President Hoover for the economy that forced them to eat it. You boil macaroni until it's soft. In a separate pot, you heat 1 can of stewed tomatoes with whatever scraps of meat you have, usually sliced hot dogs because they were the cheapest protein available at 2 cents each. You combine them with a can of corn or beans. The entire pot cost about 7 cents and lasted 2 days. Some families in the shanty towns ate this every single night for months. It doesn't sound glamorous because it wasn't. But the point of this list isn't glamour. It's the fact that 7 cents fed a family for 2 days, and your $14 takeout won't feed 2 people for 1 meal. Meal number 3, potato soup. Not the modern version with heavy cream and bacon and cheddar cheese. The real version. The one your grandmother made when the cupboard was nearly bare. You peel and boil 6 potatoes until they fall apart. You mash them directly in the water. You add salt, a teaspoon of butter or lard, and a chopped onion. If you had milk, you added a splash. If you didn't, you used the potato water itself. The starch made it thick enough to feel like a meal. Cost about 3 cents. A 3-cent soup that stuck to your ribs and kept children quiet through the night. When a mother says she made something from nothing, this is what she means. Meal number 4, bread and lard. This was not a recipe. This was survival. Families across the Midwest and the South ate sliced bread spread with lard and sprinkled with a pinch of salt or sugar as a full meal. Some added a thin layer of onion, some added nothing at all. A loaf of bread was 7 cents. A pound of lard was 8 cents. Together, they provided enough calories for a family to survive a day. Not thrive, survive. Every nutritionist today would recoil at this, but those nutritionists have never watched their children go to bed hungry. Bread and lard kept millions of American families alive between 1931 and 1936. We owe it more respect than we give it. Meal number 5, dandelion salad. Before the modern lawn care industry convinced America that dandelions were weeds, they were food, rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. Depression-era families would send their children into fields and yards every spring to pick dandelion greens by the armful. You wash them, tear them, and dress them with vinegar and a little bacon grease if you had it. Total cost, $0. Absolutely free. The most nutritious salad most Americans ever ate came from their own front yard, and the only reason we stopped eating it is because chemical lawn companies spent 60 years telling us to poison it instead. Meal number 6, cream chip beef on toast, also known by a much less polite name in the military. You take dried beef, which was one of the cheapest preserved proteins available, shred it and simmer it in a white sauce made from flour, butter, and milk. You serve it on toast. Cost, about 6 cents per serving. The military served this to millions of soldiers during both world wars because it was cheap, filling, and nearly impossible to mess up. Families at home copied the recipe because the ingredients were pantry staples that lasted for weeks without refrigeration. This meal is still served in diners across Pennsylvania and the upper Midwest. It never disappeared entirely because the people who grew up on it refused to let it die. Meal number 7, rice pudding. Not the kind you buy in a plastic cup at the grocery store for $3. The original. You take leftover cooked rice, any amount, and simmer it slowly with milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a pinch of cinnamon. You stir it until it thickens into a custard. If you had an egg, you beat it in for richness. If you didn't, the starch from the rice did the job on its own. Cost, about 3 cents. Mothers made this when there was nothing else left in the kitchen, because children will eat sweet things without complaining, even when the sweet thing is made from yesterday's leftovers and a prayer. Meal number 8, bean soup. Not a fancy bean soup, not a 15-bean artisan blend. 1 pound of dried navy beans soaked overnight, boiled the next day with a ham bone or a piece of salt pork if you had one. If you didn't, you added an onion and salt and called it done. 1 pound of beans was 6 cents. That 1 pound, properly cooked, produced enough soup for 8 to 10 servings. 6 cents, 10 servings. You cannot buy a single granola bar for 6 cents in 2026. Your great-grandmother fed her whole family dinner for less than the cost of a modern sneeze. Meal number 9, fried cornmeal mush. You boil water, stir in cornmeal and salt until it thickens into a porridge. You pour it into a loaf pan and let it cool overnight. The next morning, you slice it like bread and fry the slices in lard until they're crispy on the outside and soft in the middle. You serve them with syrup, honey, or just plain. Cost, about 2 cents. This was breakfast across Appalachia and the rural South for 3 decades. Some families ate it for breakfast and dinner on the same day. 2 cents covered 2 meals. The math doesn't lie. Meal number 10, egg drop soup. Not the version from a Chinese restaurant. The Depression-era version that Clara Canucciari's mother made twice a week. You bring a pot of water to a boil. You drop in a bouillon cube or a teaspoon of whatever seasoning you have. Then you slowly drizzle in 2 beaten eggs while stirring. The eggs cook instantly into ribbons. You add salt. You eat it with bread. Total cost, about 5 cents. Clara said her family considered this a treat because it was warm, it was fast, and it felt like more than it was. 5 cents of food that felt like comfort. That was the genius of Depression-era cooking. Not the ingredients, the illusion that everything was going to be fine. Meal number 11, cabbage and noodles. You boil egg noodles. In a separate pan, you shred half a head of cabbage and fry it in butter or lard until it browns and caramelizes. You toss the noodles into the cabbage, season with salt and pepper, and serve it in bowls. Cost about 5 cents. Cabbage was the single most important vegetable in Depression-era America because it was dirt cheap. It lasted weeks in a root cellar, and it stretched anything you added it to. Hungarian and Polish immigrant families brought this recipe to the Midwest, and it fed entire neighborhoods through the worst years. Today, a head of cabbage still costs less than $2, and this recipe still feeds a family of 6 for under $5 total. The math hasn't changed. We just stopped doing it. Meal number 12, mock apple pie. This recipe is so audacious it sounds like a joke. You take Ritz crackers, crush them, layer them in a pie crust with sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar, and bake it. No apples, not a single one. The acid from the cream of tartar and lemon juice tricks your tongue into tasting apple. The Ritz Company printed this recipe on the back of their boxes from the 1930s until the early 90s. It exists because during the Depression, apples were expensive and crackers were cheap. Mothers needed their children to believe they were eating apple pie because apple pie meant everything was normal, everything was American, everything was going to be okay. The recipe was a lie, but it was a lie that held families together, and that makes it more valuable than any recipe in any modern cookbook. Meal number 13. Wacky cake, also called crazy cake or war cake. A chocolate cake with no eggs, no butter, and no milk. You mix flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, salt, vinegar, vanilla, and vegetable oil directly in the baking pan. No mixing bowl, no stand mixer. You pour water over the top and stir it with a fork. You bake it. And somehow, against all logic, it rises into a moist, rich chocolate cake that tastes like it cost 10 times what it did. Total cost, about 8 cents. This recipe survived the Depression, both world wars, and every recession since. It's still one of the best chocolate cakes you can make, and it costs less than $1 in 2026. The reason it isn't in modern cookbooks is simple. If you know you can make a perfect cake for $1, you'll never buy a $5 box mix again. The cake mix companies know this. That's why you've never heard of wacky cake. Meal number 14, peanut butter bread. No yeast, no kneading, no rising time. You mix flour, sugar, baking powder, salt, peanut butter, and milk into a thick batter. You pour it into a loaf pan and bake it for an hour. It comes out dense, slightly sweet, and packed with enough protein and fat to keep a working man on his feet until dinner. Cost about 6 cents a loaf. The recipe requires zero skill. A child could make it. And many children did because in 1934, a lot of 10-year-olds were doing the cooking while their parents worked whatever jobs they could find. This bread is the reason peanut butter became an American staple, not because of marketing, because of survival. Meal number 15, milk toast. This is the simplest meal on the entire list. You toast a slice of bread, you put it in a bowl, you pour hot milk over it and add a pinch of salt and a small pat of butter. That is the entire recipe. Cost about 2 cents. Milk toast was the meal mothers made when someone was sick, when the pantry was empty, or when there simply wasn't anything else. It was the last line of defense between a family and genuine hunger. It sounds pathetic by modern standards, but 2 cents bought a warm meal that got a family through the night. You tell me which is more pathetic, a 2-cent bowl of milk toast that kept people alive, or a $14 smoothie that keeps people on Instagram. Meal number 16, oatmeal soup. Not oatmeal for breakfast, oatmeal as dinner. You cook oats in water with salt, add a diced onion, and if you have it, a tablespoon of butter. Some families added a handful of whatever vegetables they could find. Carrots, turnip tops, a few leaves of cabbage. The oats thickened the water into something that felt like a real soup. Cost 2 to 3 cents. This was a Scottish and Irish immigrant recipe that spread through the coal mining towns of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. Miners ate it before 14-hour shifts underground because it was the cheapest thing that would stay in their stomachs long enough to keep them standing. Meal number 17, vinegar pie. Another recipe that sounds impossible. You make a simple pie crust, fill it with a mixture of sugar, flour, butter, eggs, vanilla, and apple cider vinegar, and bake it. No fruit. The vinegar gives it tang, the sugar gives it sweetness, and together they produce a custard pie that tastes remarkably like lemon meringue. Cost about 7 cents. This pie was invented by frontier women who had no access to fresh fruit. It persisted through the Depression because the ingredients were all shelf-stable pantry staples. You could make it in January with nothing but what was already in your cupboard. No trip to the store required. Meal number 18, split pea soup. 1 pound of dried split peas was 5 cents. You boil them with water, a diced onion, a carrot if you have it, and a ham bone saved from last Sunday's dinner. You cook it until the peas dissolve into a thick, creamy soup. 1 pot fed a family of 6 for 2 nights. Total cost, about 7 cents for 2 full dinners. Split pea soup is one of the few Depression-era recipes that never lost its respectability. You can still find it in upscale restaurants for $12 a bowl. The exact same soup that cost 3.5 cents per serving in 1934. Meal number 19, hot water cornbread. No oven needed. You mix cornmeal with boiling water and a pinch of salt until it forms a thick dough. You shape it into small patties and fry them in lard or bacon grease. Crispy outside, soft inside, ready in 5 minutes. Cost 1 to 2 cents. This was the daily bread of the rural South. Families who couldn't afford wheat flour relied on cornmeal because corn grew everywhere and mills ground it cheaply. A 25-pound sack of cornmeal cost 50 cents and lasted a family a month. That's less than 2 cents a day for bread. You'll spend more than that on a single napkin at a modern restaurant. Meal number 20, sauerkraut and dumplings. You open a jar of homemade sauerkraut. Every family had one because fermenting cabbage was the cheapest way to preserve vegetables through winter. You heat it in a pot, then drop in simple dumplings made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt. The dumplings cook in the steam from the kraut, 15 minutes start to finish. Cost about 4 cents. German and Eastern European families across the Midwest survived entire winters on variations of this single dish. The fermentation gave them vitamins they couldn't get from fresh vegetables in January. The dumplings gave them the calories to heat their homes by hand. Meal number 21, fried bologna. Before bologna became a lunchbox joke, it was a survival food. You buy a whole bologna log for pennies, slice it thick, score the edges so it doesn't curl, and fry it in a dry pan until it blisters and browns. You serve it on bread with mustard. Cost 3 to 4 cents per serving. There was nothing glamorous about fried bologna. There still isn't. But it kept protein on the table when real cuts of meat were a luxury most families couldn't afford. The fact that children today have never tasted fried bologna isn't progress, it's amnesia. Meal number 22, Appalachian soup beans. You take a pound of dried pinto beans, soak them overnight, then boil them all day with a piece of fatback, salt, and black pepper. You serve them over cornbread. This was dinner in eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and southwest Virginia every single night for decades. Not just during the Depression, before it, during it, and after it. A pound of pintos, 6 cents. A piece of fatback, 3 cents. Cornbread, 2 cents. 11 cents total. Feeds 6 adults. This is the recipe that built the coal fields, the railroads, and half the infrastructure of the American South. 11 cents at a time. Meal number 23, garbage plate casserole. You take whatever leftovers you have. Day-old rice, a few vegetables going soft, a handful of macaroni, scraps of meat. You mix it all together with a can of tomato soup and bake it until it bubbles. Cost, whatever you already spent on the food you were about to throw away. This wasn't really a recipe, it was a philosophy. Waste nothing, use everything. Make it hot and call it dinner. The average American household throws away over $400 worth of food every year. A Depression-era family would have lived on that for 3 months. Meal number 24. Sugar cream pie, also called Hoosier pie because it was born in Indiana. You line a pie crust and fill it with nothing but cream, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla. No fruit, no eggs. You bake it until the top caramelizes and cracks. Cost, about 7 cents. This is the pie Indiana built its identity on. It tastes like creme brulee and costs next to nothing. The reason it disappeared from most American tables is the same reason most of these recipes disappeared. Convenience food companies convinced us that cooking from scratch was outdated. It wasn't outdated, it was competition, and they eliminated it. Meal number 25, tomato gravy on biscuits. You make simple biscuits from flour, lard, baking powder, and milk. While they bake, you cook canned tomatoes in a skillet with a little flour, butter, salt, and pepper until it thickens into a gravy. You split the biscuits and pour the tomato gravy over the top. Cost about 5 cents. This was breakfast in the American South before cereal companies spent billions convincing everyone that breakfast comes in a box. Meal number 26, potato pancakes. You grate raw potatoes, squeeze out the water, mix with 1 egg, a tablespoon of flour, and salt. You fry spoonfuls in lard until golden. Cost, 2 to 3 cents. Jewish, Polish, German, and Irish immigrant families all had their version of this exact recipe. They disagreed on everything else, but they agreed on this. When you have potatoes and nothing else, you grate them, and you fry them, and you eat. Meal number 27. This is the one I told you to wait for. Depression-era vegetable stew. The recipe that Big Food has spent 50 years pretending doesn't exist. You take whatever vegetables you can get. Potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, cabbage, celery tops. The greens from beets, the stems from herbs. Things modern grocery stores throw away by the ton. You dice everything and boil it in water with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. If you have a bone, any bone, you add it. You cook it low and slow until the water turns into broth, and the vegetables turn into something that tastes like it took hours of skill to make. It didn't take skill, it took patience. The whole pot costs 11 cents. It feeds 8 people. And here's the part nobody tells you. It is more nutritious than 90% of what you'll find in the prepared foods aisle of any modern supermarket, because every single ingredient is a whole vegetable. No preservatives, no stabilizers, no sodium levels that require a warning label. Just food. The way food used to be before somebody figured out they could charge you $9 for the same thing in a microwavable container. This recipe didn't die because it stopped working. It died because it was too cheap to be profitable. Meal number 28, cornbread and buttermilk. Not a side dish, the main event. You crumble leftover cornbread into a glass or a bowl and pour cold buttermilk over it. You eat it with a spoon. Cost, about 3 cents. This was supper across the rural South more nights than anyone cares to admit. It sounds strange if you didn't grow up with it, but ask anyone over 70 from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, or Tennessee, and watch their face change. They remember. It was their mother's kitchen. It was Tuesday night. It was enough. Meal number 29, biscuits and chocolate gravy. You make the same simple biscuits from recipe 25. Then you make a gravy from cocoa powder, flour, sugar, milk, and butter. You pour it over the biscuits. Cost about 5 cents. This was the Depression-era version of dessert for breakfast, invented by Appalachian mothers who couldn't afford syrup or jam or fresh fruit, but could afford a tin of cocoa and a sack of flour. Children who grew up on chocolate gravy remember it as the single best thing they ever ate. Not because the ingredients were special, because it meant their mother found a way. Again. Meal number 30, flour sack clothing. This isn't a recipe, but it belongs on this list because it tells you everything you need to know about how Depression-era families thought about waste. Flour and animal feed came in cotton sacks. When the sack was empty, mothers washed it, cut it, and sewed it into dresses, shirts, curtains, and quilts. The flour companies noticed, and in one of the only genuinely decent things a corporation has ever done, they started printing their sacks with colorful floral patterns so the clothing would look better. That's how far these families stretched a dollar. They wore their groceries, and the grocery company helped them look good doing it. Here's what all 30 of these meals have in common. Not one of them required a food processor, a stand mixer, a subscription box, or a trip to Whole Foods. They required a pot, a stove, and a person who refused to let her family go hungry. That's it. We didn't lose these recipes because they failed. We lost them because an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars needs you to believe that feeding your family requires their products. It doesn't. It never did. It requires 4 cents worth of potatoes and someone willing to stand at the stove. If this changed how you think about food, subscribe. I'm publishing 2 of these every week. The next video you need to watch is 20 things every American kitchen had before 1950 that have completely disappeared. It shows you exactly which tools and traditions were removed from your home and why the companies that replace them don't want you to know they ever existed. Link is on screen now. Drop a comment with the recipe your grandmother made that nobody makes anymore. I read every single one. See you in the next one.